Well, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome. It's really great to see a full hall here tonight. And this, as you will know, is part of the Mansfield commemoration set of events that's going on. I'm John Horrocks. I'm one of the group that put tonight's short photographic tribute to Mansfield together, and once again it's very good to see you, but I do have a few housekeeping things to say at the beginning. First of all, and I won't say in the unlikely event of an emergency, so I'll spare you that, but emergency doors are to that side of the hall there. The toilets are over here, and after the water failed a few minutes ago, apparently it's now back on, just to reassure you. So we're very grateful that Wellesley College and the principal, Michael Bain, have allowed us to use this venue. And there's a number of reasons for this. And one of the principal ones is that this was one of the few buildings in this part of Days Bay that was here when Mansfield's family had a cottage at nearby Downs Point over there, just a short walk away, and she would have walked past what is the old school building many times. At that stage it was functioning not as a school actually, but as a hotel called Days Bay House. So that's one of the reasons. Another reason is we were lucky to use this site as one of the in one of the scenes for our short photographic essay. So you'll see that when it's shown later in the evening. So Mansfield herself might have been unaware when she was here that there had been a small kāinga just along there by the hills, Te Whārangi. And it's one of the great what-ifs about her is what might have happened if she hadn't gone to Europe for good in 1908. What would she have written about? She was very interested at that stage of her life in the Maori language, and that's an interest that really faded away once she got to Europe. But she did, in an early journal and in a poem, she recorded a fragment of a whakataiki which begins He huru huru te manu karere, which is a proverbial saying about the feathers of a bird, and it emphasizes that the outward form of dress or language must match the occasion. Now, what we have here, we don't have this story, we don't have this story of what she might have done, but we do have instead At the Bay, which is what we've based our production on this evening. And it's an icon of modernist literature, but it also fulfills some of the demands of that whakataiki, because it perfectly encapsulates what life was here when she was a child in this area. And she felt so strongly about that she felt that she'd brought the dead to life again. And she said, writing to one of her friends, "There's my grandmother, back in her chair with her pink knitting. There stalks my uncle over the grass. I feel as I write, you are not dead, my darlings. You may live again through me in all your richness and beauty." So we hope that some sense of those figures she wanted so desperately to recall will be there in our tribute to her. It actually wasn't easy always to get things right, and in one scene Linda Burnell is looking at her baby, and a doll was used for the initial scenes, and the doll had an arm up like this and a ghastly fixed a deep blue eye that just looked in one direction. It reminded me of something like A Nightmare in Elm Street. So it was very obvious a real baby would be better. And in fact, a baby was found, not captured but found, and the replacement turned out to be one of the best actors in the whole production. And I'm saying that, I know some of the actors are here, so don't take that too hard, folks. So, look, we've had strong support from this project right from the beginning, as well as the Historical Society of Eastbourne and local historian Alison Carew. I'd like to acknowledge the substantial grant from the Eastbourne Bays Community Trust and the help of its chair, George Tuffin. The actors from the Butterfly Creek Theatre Troupe, and you'll see them, we'll introduce them at the end of the evening, under the direction of Anne Manchester, were an essential part of the recreation of the scenes from At the Bay, while Simon Hoyle, who's over there from Southlight Studio in Days Bay, was able to put the whole production together at a time when he and Janet Andrews were incredibly busy completing a series of documentaries about the New Zealand coast for the Department of Conservation. Finally, and I keep forgetting I should tell you this, we are going to have some music to start with, and if you've got your phone on, please put it on mute or turn it off. And Mansfield, as many of you know, was an accomplished cellist herself, and it's fitting that our very first item tonight is a performance by cellist Martin Griffiths, who's also a Mansfield scholar, accompanied by pianist Sherry Grant, who's recently completed an extended cycle of poems about Katherine Mansfield, and copies of her poems are there on the shelf of books behind us. I think we've been very fortunate to have not only this performance, but from people who are musicians, but also have written so thoughtfully about Mansfield. And I can't remember it's in the program or not, but Martin's had completed a doctorate on Arnold Trowell's music. So we're looking at people who've really embedded themselves not just in the music, but in Mansfield's associations and her writing as well. Now the next speaker, or the first speaker, I'm going to ask to come up now is Redma Isker. And Redma's recently produced one of the most remarkable books on Mansfield and about her years in Europe. Some of you will possibly have read his earlier books, his earlier book on Mansfield, A Strange, Beautiful Excitement, about her childhood in Wellington. And there have been many biographies of Mansfield, sometimes I think maybe too many, and Redma's been able to do something that most biographers can't do. He takes you, the young girl, for example, walking the streets of Karori. He takes you through the locations in Europe, the Victoria Hotel in Paris, the French coast, the mountains in Switzerland, an odd spa in Bavaria, and you actually feel what it was like to be Mansfield going there. Now this is a unique skill. I really commend Redma's books to you, and I'm delighted that he's able to be here. So I'd like to welcome you to join us, Redma. And here we are. Coming up. I won't fall off the platform.
Don't.
Thank you, Redma. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Oh, thank you for a very kind introduction, John. Wasn't that beautiful music? Thank you so much, Martin. Absolutely gorgeous, and it really seemed to sort of take me back to that. Just sort of being transported back in time. Really, it was quite amazing. So we're going to start this evening. We've got a few pictures here that we're going to look at tonight. Not too many. And what we've got here is we start this evening high in the Swiss Alps, here at this luxury hotel. And it is May 1921. So we're going to go back to May 1921. And that month, Katherine Mansfield, aged 32, checks in here to the palace on the top of Montana Plateau. And this mountain, this plateau, stands above the sunny little town of Sierra, an hour from Geneva. Now Mansfield arrives here at the hotel terribly ill with tuberculosis, also known as consumption. You would have heard of that. And she once said of her tubercular cough, "At each breath a dragging, boiling, bubbling sound is heard. I sip water, spit, sip, spit. I feel I must break my heart." As she reached Switzerland, the cough was worse than ever. She called her inflamed lungs a helpless, exhausted little black silk bag. But wait, as I hope to show tonight, 1921 became her miraculous year. First of all, however, I'm going to do a bit of what might be called biographical housekeeping. I'm guessing many here will know lots about KM, Katherine Mansfield, but some of you won't. Now, Kathleen Mansfield Beecham was born in 1888 on Tinakori Road in Hokawakawa, Thorndon, third child of a colonial millionaire and eminent citizen of Wellington. She lived and attended schools in the capital until she was 14. At 10, she first holidayed on this side of the harbour at Muratai. In 1903, her family travelled to London so that Kathleen and two sisters could finish their education, returning to Wellington in 1906. By then, the Beechams owned a cottage on the northern tip of Days Bay, just really down over there at Downs Point. In 1908, in July, Mansfield headed back to London, never to return. And in 1923, 100 years ago this year, she died of tuberculosis in Fontainebleau, Avon, an hour by train from Paris. She was author of 88 stories, or 89 if you like, if you include the Allo, the first version of Prelude. So there we have it. Now we associate Mansfield with early 20th century literary London, the Bloomsbury group, Virginia Woolf and that crowd. And there's a lot of truth in that. But she came to prefer the European continent, especially France, and especially in her later years as her health failed. And this is the argument that I make in my new book, which John mentioned, Katherine Mansfield's Europe, Station to Station. Between 2017 and 2019, I retraced her footsteps through Germany, France and Switzerland, recording what I saw using her letters and diaries as my maps. And I found out that the beaches, cities and mountains of Europe were her haven, her wonderland, the backdrop for her imperishable stories. Now Kiwis often place her at gorgeous Menton. We all know about Menton in the south of France, on the Riviera. But when she was living there, the humidity became intolerable because of her terrible lungs. She lay by the blue ocean, spitting blood. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't even walk. Instead, she headed for the cool, dry air of Switzerland. In Sierra, she had a consultation with the Palace Hotel owner, a tall, rangy skier and lung specialist named Dr. Theodore Stefani. He tapped her rib cage and listened to the stethoscope. He gave her hope. Quote, "After I'd seen this man, it was just as if the landscape, everything changed a little, moved a little further off." She added, quote, "I'm going to be under him in future. All he would say is that I have a chance, and he's known patients with lungs as far gone as mine who have recovered." So we imagine her entering the great Palace Hotel with its glass verandas, central heating, and fine cuisine with second breakfasts. It's not obvious from the photo, but this was a sanatorium, but it doesn't say so. And tuberculosis sufferers lay on wide balconies in the sunshine, on chaise longue, wrapped in blankets, looking out at the breathtaking scenery. But Mansfield and her husband, John Middleton Murray, only lasted here a few days. The Stefani regime of enforced rest was not for Mansfield. She had work to do, and she knew the clock was ticking. So instead she moved here to the Chalet des Sapins, minutes by carriage from the Palace Hotel. She'd write, "At the moment I can only walk from the carriage to the door. Can't mount a stair, can't do anything. But I look out at mountains that make one feel one is living in the eye of the Lord." Rooms were small, darkly varnished. Her big top floor bedroom had a carved balcony, one on the right, where she'd feed the goldfinches. That was later. On arrival, KM was so weak that her trusted companion, Ida Baker, lugged a round tin bath up the stairs, filled it with hot water and washed her, quote, like a baby. And she gathered her strength, well, mostly. Here in the Pines, she found a temporary reprieve from her illness. Her writing blossomed wildly. Several dozen stories emerged here. Increasingly, her thoughts drifted home to Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington, where she'd spent 17 of her 32 years. She was determined to finish the project she began in 1915 after her beloved younger brother, Chummy, or Leslie, died in the war. And she wrote about him and her project. Now I want to write recollections of my own country. Yes, I want to write about my own country till I simply exhaust my store. Not only because it's a sacred debt that I pay to my country, because my brother and I were born there, but also because in my thoughts I range with him over all the remembered places. Each day in the Alps, bright morning sun helped get her started. She opened the curtains, lay back in her sheets and basked. By lunchtime the glare was still so strong that to work she had to pull down striped cotton blinds and tap away on a black Corona typewriter. She'd pause to light a cigarette, reread what she'd written. On many days, however, she had to stay in bed. Evenings were special, a reunion time when Mansfield and her husband John curled up by the fire. They'd sit there reading their books and chain smoking. They played chess, sometimes cribbage, using nuts for counters. Some of the time, K.M. knitted, not always happily. She wrote, "I softly murmur over my needles. I find knitting turns me into an imbecile." It is the female tradition, I suppose. After years of anxiety, financial insecurity, and deteriorating health, a stable and comforting domestic routine emerged that summer. An idea that had long been in her mind now stirred. I long above everything to write about family love. The love between growing children and the love of a mother for her son and the father's feeling. But warm, vivid, intimate, not made up, not self-conscious. Would she get it done in time? Her health remained precarious. A purulent, never said that word before, a purulent tubercular gland in her neck needed constant invasive draining. Quote, "Went to the palace and had the gland punctured. It is very unlikely that they will save the skin. I shall be back at the palace before the week is out. In the meantime, I am exhausted and I can't write a stroke." Tough times. But her family tale was surfacing. Quote, "It's, I hope, full of sand and seaweed and bathing dresses hanging on verandas and sand shoes on windowsills and rather gritty sandwiches and the tide coming in." On good days in hot August, she allocated 7 hours a day to it. And after 3 false starts, she landed a masterpiece. A single, timeless summer's day lived between the tides. She drew on childhood beach holidays here at Muritai, Days Bay and Anikiwa in the Marlborough Sounds, buckets and sandcastles by a breathing sea. On September the 12th, Mansfield wrote to her friend, quote, "Finished last night at 10:30. Laid down the pen after writing, thanks be to God. I wish there was a God." The title is At the Bay. That's the name of the very long story, a continuation of Prelude. It's about 60 pages. I've been at it all last night. The fevered atmosphere of the creative process comes through. And she wrote, "My precious children have sat in here with me playing cards. I've wandered about in all sorts of places, in and out. It is so strange to bring the dead back to life again. There's my grandmother back in her chair with her pink knitting. There stalks my uncle over the grass. I feel as I write, you are not dead, my darlings. All is remembered. I bow down to you. I efface myself so that you may live again through me in your richness and beauty. And one feels possessed. And then the piece where it all happens. I've tried to make it as familiar to you as it is to me. Now, one of the miracles about the Bay is the way that Mansfield smuggles in the view from the balcony of her varnished Swiss chalet. We see the Alps glinting on the bottom of a Downs Point rock pool. Listen to this. Looking down, bending over, each pool was like a lake with pink and blue houses clustered on the shores, and oh, the vast mountainous country behind those houses, the ravines, the passes, the dangerous creeks and fearful tracks that led to the water's edge. And Mansfield was writing of what she knew. We have hard evidence the Beecham kids were left free to roam. They were free range. Not so good for burn times. Decades later, KM's big sister Vera recalled the painful reality of long days at the beach. We got very sunburned. We even had to have the doctor see us. We had enormous blisters on our legs. By November 1921, snow-covered Montana Plateau, KM wrote, words can't describe the cold here. We have central heating, which never goes out, but even then I freeze absolutely hard. That blissful summer in the Black Pines offered a temporary respite, but a TB cure was as elusive as ever. The eternal search began again, a Russian specialist, her 20th doctor in 8 years. She'd read of Dr. Manukin's claims that TB patients had recovered after his radiation treatments. Katherine, fretting in her Snowdon chalet, convinced him to treat her. So early in 1922, as the Swiss winter bit deep, she left her magic mountain for her beloved Paris. 5 months of expensive and agonising treatments began. She left Paris mid-year, daring believe her condition was improving. The proof seems real. I hardly ever cough. I have gained 8 pounds. So far it seems I'm getting quite well. We're back in Switzerland, in Sierra, below the mountain, at the Hotel Chateau Bellevue. KM holed up here in the summer months of 1922 and wrote her final stories, including The Canary. Her TB had roared back. It had never gone away. The Paris radiation sessions failed. She was coughing and coughing. It was a devastating development. I'm almost as ill as I ever was, in every way. I simply stare at the sky. I'm too tired even to think. But she finds enough energy to join husband John Murray in games of snooker down in the hotel basement. They shared hours here together, chalking cues, knocking balls around a baize table under a bright light. She learnt that back in Wellington as a school kid, in Premier House actually. Her energy runs out that summer in the sun-ripened Swiss valley. Her final months pass in France in Fontainebleau near Paris. On the 9th of January 1923 she collapses and dies. John Murray arranges the funeral, then Scarpa's soon after the burial. We now fast forward to 1949, when Kiwi diplomats flew into Paris to open our first legation. And what's that got to do with KM, you might ask? Well, our diplomats discovered that France had a love affair with Katherine Mansfield. Who knew? American biographer Sylvia Berkman wrote, that the French perceive in Mansfield an enchanting spirit, mystic, poet, child, which strove courageously to come to terms with life, yet failed. She was famous there. In 1938, the daily newspaper Le Figaro ran headlines, "Today, Katherine Mansfield would have been 50. France's rapture with Mansfield became the key to unlocking relations between a young colonial nation and a haughty European power. So here's this pic of our first diplomats flanking their Prime Minister, Peter Fraser, in the middle. France's infatuation with Katherine baffled the arriving Kiwis. Here in New Zealand, she was not widely known in 1949. Now, Jean Mackenzie, on the right, was our first charge d'affaires in Paris. Mackenzie hosted a string of diplomatic receptions in New Zealand's Grand Embassy, helped by a resident chef and a formidable wine cellar. And when Mansfield's name was embossed on gold-edged invitation cards for cocktails, France's political creme de la creme showed up. Kiwi diplomats basked in the glow, telling head office, if a Frenchman has heard of New Zealand, the chances are that it will be for one of three things: her war record, rugby, or Katherine Mansfield. As the years passed, Mansfield's grave at Avon became exalted cultural and diplomatic turf, and yet the granite stone on her grave originally bore no mention of her ties to New Zealand. Now that changed in 1957 when Mansfield's gravestone and part of the inscription had added to it, born in Wellington, New Zealand. The fact that it's carved there at all was the result of a quiet diplomatic coup by someone from this side of the harbour, nearby Mahina Bay in fact. For decades the original inscription read, Katherine Mansfield, wife of John Middleton Murray, died at Avon, 1888-1923, as if this was Mansfield's only claim to fame. And one of the people in that photo, the guy on the extreme left, Joseph Wilson, conspired to turn that around. He was a former international diplomat, war hero, and eminent classic scholar who helped create our Foreign Service. He was also a fan of Mansfield, first reading her in 1922. While ambassador to France, Wilson hatched a plan to get the additional line, born in Wellington, New Zealand, inscribed. Within weeks of Murray's death in 1957, Wilson had the grave restored, and that was the opportunity to add her birthplace in New Zealand. It represented an annexation of her grave on the part of her home country, an unfurling of our flag, if you will. The grave was then ready for commemoration in 1958 for what would have been Katherine's 70th birthday. Wilson was determined to honour her appropriately. I found official files showing how far he went to ensure it wasn't just the headstone that paid tribute to New Zealand. He commissions a floral wreath including flowers from his own garden just along from here, one or two bays along. His family home in Mahina Road was at the time being rented out because he was in Paris, of course. He wrote, "I do not think she could endure one of those enormous French wreaths, coloured ribbons and all, which the shops would provide, but I feel that some New Zealand foliage would be acceptable." So Wilson specified a bouquet, a gerbe in French, of natives. Kofi, kauri, rangiora, pink manuka blossoms surrounded by arum lilies. He wants Kofi foliage to be snipped from his trees, then carried to Paris by flying boat, a voyage that at the time took 4 days. And he wrote, "Go round to my house and ask the tenants if they would let me have some of mine, if it's not finished." I could say not too inaccurately that it was taken from Mansfield's bay. Now Wilson's boss at Foreign Affairs, Alistair McIntosh, who was also in that photo, another Mansfield devotee, pulls out all the stops, and Mansfield's precious bouquet is flown right around the world. It's an extraordinary homage for a former colony that until then had paid scant regard to its writers, especially a Bohemian woman. The emotion shows in Wilson's speech delivered in French that October evening in 1958 at our embassy by the Arc de Triomphe. We picture him standing in the grand salon at the top of a sweeping marble staircase with its mirrored walls and a 10-metre high ceiling. Wilson sounds both jubilant and reflective. Quote, "This morning we laid on her grave in Avon greenery that was gathered in New Zealand and transported here on French wings. Some of this greenery was gathered at the Bay, that bay near Wellington that the art of Katherine Mansfield brings to life in one of her stories. May a shared memory bring together in this moment the friends of Katherine Mansfield surrounded here by this autumn evening, and there by a spring dawn." And I'd like to end with some beautiful images from Avon Cemetery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Redma, for giving us this small insight into your magnificent book, which I've read and thoroughly recommend. It's wonderful to understand something of the circumstances in which Katherine Mansfield wrote At the Bay and other brilliant New Zealand stories like The Garden Party and The Doll's House. We are the richer for your journeys across KM's Europe, Redma. Kia ora tātou. I'm Anne Manchester, and I'm part of the creative team and director of the about-to-be-launched photographic tribute. When John Horrocks suggested late last year that a group get together and do something locally to mark this KM centenary, the initial thoughts revolved around a reading of the story in various locations. Somehow the idea of doing something more permanent emerged. So from humble beginnings, we finally arrive at this grand occasion tonight, a world premiere, no less. Having decided to create a tribute in photographs, using actors and narration, we realised we could not possibly do the whole story. We set out instead to capture its spirit in just a few carefully selected scenes. Just how many photos would be needed to capture the drama? What music should we use? Should the actors voice the dialogue, or should the narrator read it all? These questions took a while to answer. We wanted this to be a local response, using the various skills we had and actors from our local theatre troupe, including, as it turned out, Sir Ashley Bloomfield. I think most of you are aware that Ashley agreed to don the stripy swimsuit and play Stanley Burnell with only a week's notice after the actor originally cast was unable to continue. So the community pitched in to make this happen. I am incredibly grateful to have been part of this project and to have worked with such a creative, committed group of people. Mind you, John Horrocks was not that helpful to the team or himself when he fell off a ladder in Auckland just over a month ago. During those first 2 weeks at North Shore Hospital, things were looking a little grim. Would he even be able to attend the launch? Fortunately, his recovery has been pretty remarkable, and I am so grateful he could be here tonight, upright and barely a crutch in sight. Simon Hoyle, as photographer and editor, and me as director and narrator have given this project our all, with Simon doing a great deal of overtime beyond his day job to realise it. We had to do various reshoots, and as John said earlier, decided to recruit a real baby, having initially thought a doll would do. A few weeks ago, I gave my niece in Christchurch a sneaky preview of the nearly finished film. "Why did you choose to combine video with still photos?" she asked. She was incredulous that the whole film is entirely comprised of still photos. There's not a moving image among them. Or is there? I am delighted with the performance of all the actors, two of whom are here tonight. I think they really capture the characters of Linda and Stanley Burnell, Jonathan Trout, Beryl Fairfield, and the boy. Not all of them could be here tonight, but Ashley sends his best wishes from Europe for a successful launch. We hope this film will have a long life beyond tonight and be shown many times in many places. And if you look on the back of your programme, you will find an online link so you can easily view the film again, though you are unlikely to see it on such a wonderfully large screen again. There is also an email for the Historical Society of Eastbourne if you have any questions or want to talk about future public screenings. If you know the story at the Bay, we hope the images we have captured in our tribute will add to your own. And if you don't know it, perhaps you will be inspired to go home and dig out your copy of Katherine Mansfield's stories, stashed at the back of the bookcase, and get reading. I now invite Alison Carew, researcher for the Historical Society of Eastbourne, to come forwards, and she will show us what this area was like when Katherine Mansfield and her family holidayed here.
Thank you, Anne, and kia ora, everyone. My role this evening is to set the scene for our photographic tribute to At the Bay. Let's begin by meeting the Beecham family. This photograph from the Turnbull Library collection was taken in the late 1890s, around the time the family spent their first summer on this side of the harbour. So here we see Harold and Annie Beecham with their 5 children. On the right is Kathleen, the middle child, better known, of course, as Katherine Mansfield. Although the Burnell family in At the Bay is loosely based on Mansfield's own family, she did change a number of details. For example, there are only 4 Burnell children in the story, and also they are several years younger than the Beecham children were at the time. As noted in your programme, the old photographs used in our tribute to At the Bay are all from the Historical Society of Eastbourne's archive collection. But now we're going to show you a few other photographs from the collection that we didn't use to give you an idea of what this place looked like around the time the story is set. Like the story itself, we start with a crescent-shaped bay with rocky headlands at each end and a dusty road skirting the beach. This is Days Bay in 1906. Mansfield's father, Harold Beecham, had recently purchased a piece of land at Downs Point at the northern end of the bay and had a small cottage built there for family use. Mansfield described the cottage: a small poverty-stricken sitting room, a cabin-like bedroom fitted with bunks, and an outhouse with a bath and a wood cellar, coal cellar complete. There was no garden, just the sea stretching right up to the yard. In the 18 months before she left New Zealand for good in 1908, Mansfield used the cottage as a welcome bolt hole from the city. By then she would have been in her late teens. On one occasion, she and her sister Charlotte, accompanied by their maid, came to bathe and row and walk in the bush or by the sea. The crescent shape of the bay, and the family having owned a cottage here, pointed to Days Bay being the setting for At the Bay. And for many years that was what everyone assumed, and some people still do. But in other ways, Days Bay does not fit the story very well. For example, surely that cottage would have been too small to accommodate a family of 4 adults and 4 children, plus a servant girl. And where are the bungalows of the summer colony with their gardens of marigolds and pinks, and the paddocks and sand dunes that Stanley races across to have his early morning swim? And what about the store with the big gum tree in front, where Alice the maid goes to have afternoon tea with Mrs. Stubbs? To answer these questions, we need to travel further south and to go back for a few years. But before we do, I'd like to point out a few landmarks that would have been familiar to Mansfield during her visits to Days Bay. This photograph shows the popular Days Bay resort in its heyday, when it was known as Wellington's Playground. The wharf is where the big steam ferries brought literally thousands of day trippers across from town on weekends and public holidays. Road access around the harbour was very poor, so the families of the summer colony would also have come over by ferry, with a servant bringing the luggage and the provisions by horse and dray, as in the story Prelude. Opposite the wharf is the ornate pavilion, which served lunches and afternoon teas. We can also see the bathing huts on the beach, the tennis courts, the famous water slide, and the hockey fields. And in the hills beyond, a network of popular bush tracks. North of the pavilion is Days Bay House, a grand hotel built in 1903 to attract well-to-do holidaymakers. It was not a success, and in 1913 was sold and converted to a private school for boys. In 1940, that school became Wellesley College, which is, of course, where we are this evening. So this is the bay where Mansfield and her sister would swim, row, and walk, and maybe they also played tennis on these courts and took afternoon tea at the pavilion. But now we're heading south, following the road around Windy Point, through Rona Bay and on to Miratai, the name for the southern part of Eastbourne. And this is our destination, the Glen, seen here in 1913. In 1969, a Mansfield scholar by the name of Maud Morris published an article in the Turnbull Library Record in which she argued that this property, and not the Downs Point cottage, was the setting for At the Bay. In the late 1930s, her husband, Guy Morris, had corresponded with Harold Beecham, who told Morris he had rented this cottage for his family for several summers, starting, we believe, in 1899 when Mansfield was 11. The property was then owned by Mr. Sidney Burrode, a banking associate of Beecham's. Interestingly, Beecham claimed that he never stayed a night at the Glen. I wonder if he wished to dissociate himself from his daughter's portrayal of Stanley Burnell. As we can see, the Glen does tick more boxes than the Downs Point cottage as the setting for the story. For example, there's the veranda where the bathing dresses and towels were hung to dry. The grass patch in front where we can imagine Linda and the baby resting under the manuka tree, which rather oddly has yellow flowers in the story. The surrounding bush and hills with a stream flowing down to the right of the house. Start of sight. This wider view of Muirthai was taken in 1902, the final year that Mansfield spent a summer holiday here. The glen is just out of sight on the left. So here is the summer colony, just as Mansfield describes it. The scattering of bungalows, most of them holiday homes owned by Wellington families. The paddocks with their awkward stiles, the sand dunes, and the long white sand beach where the summer colony came down to bathe. On the other hand, Muirthai is clearly not a crescent-shaped bay, and the road runs inland here, not alongside the beach as it does in Days Bay. But what we can see in the foreground are the horse bus stables owned by Mr. Dennis Kelly. I'm impressed that Mansfield remembered his name 20 years later. He was said to be a jovial soul, though rather unreliable, owing to his fondness for drink. We can even see a horse bus, or coach as Stanley calls it, parked outside, and 2 horses standing in the yard. And here is one of Kelly's coaches. This is how Stanley would have begun his morning commute to town, wearing his blue serge suit, stiff collar and bowler hat. It evidently got very hot and stuffy in there, especially when it rained and the canvas sides had to be rolled down. And a bit further south is Muirthai Park Store, located just off the road with a large tree in front, 2 big windows for eyes and a broad veranda for a hat, just as Mansfield describes Mrs. Stubbs's store. Harold Beecham recalled the store being about opposite the glen and thought it had been run by a Mrs. Jones. He described her as quite an original character and fancied that his daughter made some use of her in 1 or 2 of her stories. So Mrs. Jones could well have been the inspiration for Mrs. Stubbs. There are other possible models for Mrs. Stubbs' store, but I must say I prefer this one. So there you have it, 2 holiday cottages in 2 very different bays, both with strong connections to Mansfield's time here, yet neither a perfect fit with the story. It seemed clear that when Mansfield was writing her story 20 years later, she drew intensively on her memories of both Days Bay and Muirthai, and also that she selected, merged and shaped those memories to suit her creative purpose. Now, to finish setting the scene, here is a short interlude celebrating summer at the Bay. This will be followed by our photographic tribute to Mansfield's classic New Zealand story, At the Bay. We hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
very early morning. The sun was not yet risen, and the whole of Crescent Bay was hidden under a white sea mist. The big bush-covered hills at the back were smothered. You could not see where they ended, and the paddocks and bungalows began. The sandy road was gone, and the paddocks and bungalows the other side of it. There were no white dunes covered with reddish grass beyond them. There was nothing to mark which was beach and where was the sea. A heavy dew had fallen. The grass was blue. Big drops hung on the bushes and just did not fall. The silvery, fluffy toy was limp on its long stalks. And all the marigolds and the pinks in the bungalow gardens were bowed to the earth with wetness. Drenched with the cold fuchsias, round pearls of dew lay on the flat nasturtium leaves. It looked as though the sea had beaten up softly in the darkness, as though one immense wave had come, rippling, rippling. How far? Perhaps if you had waked up in the middle of the night, you might have seen a big fish flicking in at the window and gone again. Ah, ah, sounded the sleepy sea. And from the bush there came the sound of little streams flowing quickly, lightly, slipping between the smooth stones, gushing into ferny basins and out again. And there was the splashing of big drops on large leaves, and something else. What was it? A faint stirring and shaking, the snapping of a twig, and then such silence that it seemed someone was listening. Round the corner of Crescent Bay, between the piled-up masses of broken rock, a flock of sheep came pattering. They were huddled together, a small, tossing, woolly mass, and their thin, stick-like legs trotted along quickly, as if the cold and the quiet had frightened them. Behind them, an old sheepdog, his soaking paws covered with sand, ran along with his nose to the ground, but carelessly, as if thinking of something else. And then, in the rocky gateway, the shepherd himself appeared. One hand was crammed into his belt. The other grasped a beautifully smooth yellow stick. Then something immense came into view. An enormous, shock-haired giant with his arms stretched out. It was the big gum tree outside Mrs. Stubbs's shop. And as they passed by, there was a strong whiff of eucalyptus. A few moments later, the back door of one of the bungalows opened, and a figure in a broad striped bathing suit flung down the paddock, cleared the stile, rushed through the tussock grass into the hollow, staggered up the sandy hillock, and raced for dear life over the big porous stones, over the cold wet pebbles, onto the hard sand that gleamed like oil. Splish, splosh, splish, splosh. The water bubbled round his legs as Stanley Burnell waded out exulting. First man in as usual. He'd beaten them all again. And he swooped down to souse his head and neck. Hail, brother! All hail, thou mighty one! A velvety bass voice came booming over the water. Great Scott, damnation take it! Stanley lifted up to see a dark head bobbing far out and an arm lifted. It was Jonathan Trout, there before him. "Glorious morning," sang the voice. "Yes, very fine," said Stanley briefly. Why the diggance didn't the fellow stick to his part of the sea? Why should he come barging over to this exact spot? Stanley gave a kick, a lunge, and struck out, swimming overarm. But Jonathan was a match for him. Up he came, his black hair sleek on his forehead, his short beard sleek. "I had an extraordinary dream last night," he shouted. What was the matter with the man? This mania for conversation irritated Stanley beyond words. And it was always the same. Always some piffle about a dream he'd had, or some cranky idea he'd got hold of, or some rot he'd been reading. Stanley turned over on his back and kicked with his legs till he was a living waterspout. But even then, "I dreamed I was hanging over a terrifically high cliff, shouting to someone below." You would be, thought Stanley. He could stick no more of it. He stopped splashing. "Look here, Trout," he said. "I'm in rather a hurry this morning." "You're what?" Jonathan was so surprised, or pretended to be, that he sank under the water, then appeared again blowing. "All I mean is," said Stanley, "I've no time to fool about. I want to get this over. I'm in a hurry. I've work to do this morning, see?" Jonathan was gone before Stanley had finished. "Pass, friend," said the bass voice gently. And he slid away through the water with scarcely a ripple. But curse the fellow, he'd ruined Stanley's bathe. What an unpractical idiot the man was. Stanley struck out to sea again, and then as quickly swam in again, and away he rushed up the beach. He felt cheated. In a steamer chair under a manuka tree that grew in the middle of the front grass patch, Linda Burnell dreamed the morning away. She did nothing. She looked up at the dark, close, dry leaves of the manuka, at the chinks of blue between, and now and again a tiny yellowish flower dropped on her. On the grass beside her, lying between two pillows, was the boy. Sound asleep he lay, his head turned away from his mother. Linda frowned. She sat up quickly in her steamer chair and clasped her ankles. Yes, that was her real grudge against life. That was what she could not understand. That was the question she asked and listened in vain for the answer. It was all very well to say it was the common lot of women to bear children. It wasn't true. She, for one, could prove that wrong. She was broken, made weak. Her courage was gone through childbearing. And what made it doubly hard to bear was she did not love her children. It was useless pretending. The boy had turned over. He lay facing her, and he was no longer asleep. His dark blue baby eyes were open. He looked as though he was peeping at his mother. And suddenly his face dimpled. It broke into a wide, toothless smile, a perfect beam, no less. I'm here, that happy smile seemed to say. Why don't you like me? There was something so quaint, so unexpected about that smile that Linda smiled herself. But she checked herself and said to the boy coldly, I don't like babies. Don't like babies? The boy couldn't believe her. Don't like me? He waved his arms foolishly at his mother. Linda dropped off her chair onto the grass. Why do you keep smiling? She said severely. If you knew what I was thinking, you wouldn't. But he only squeezed up his eyes slyly and rolled his head on the pillow. He didn't believe a word she said. Why does one feel so different at night? Why is it so exciting to be awake when everybody else is asleep? Late, it is very late. And yet every moment you feel more and more wakeful, as though you were slowly, almost with every breath, waking up into a new, wonderful, far more thrilling and exciting world than the daylight one. Beryl smiled, bit her lip and gazed over the garden. As she gazed, she saw somebody, a man, leave the road, step along the paddock beside their palings, as if he was coming straight towards her. Her heart beat. Who was it? Who could it be? It couldn't be a burglar, certainly not a burglar, for he was smoking and he strolled lightly. Beryl's heart leapt. It seemed to turn right over and then to stop. She recognised him. Good evening, Miss Beryl, said the voice softly. Good evening. Won't you come for a little walk? It drawled. Come for a walk at that time of night? I couldn't. Everybody's in bed. Everybody's asleep. Oh, said the voice lightly, and a whiff of sweet smoke reached her. What does everybody matter? Do come. It's such a fine night. There's not a soul about. Beryl shook her head, but already something stirred in her, something reared its head. The voice said, Frightened? It mocked. Poor little girl. Not in the least, said she. As she spoke, that weak thing within her seemed to uncoil, to grow suddenly tremendously strong. She longed to go. And just as if this was quite understood by the other, the voice said, gently and softly, but finally, come along. Beryl stepped over her low window, crossed the veranda, ran down the grass to the gate. He was there before her. That's right, breathed the voice, and it teased. You're not frightened, are you? You're not frightened? Not in the least, she said lightly. Why should I be? Her hand was pulled gently, tugged. She held back. No, I'm not coming any further, said Beryl. Oh, rot. Harry Kember didn't believe her. Come along. We'll just go as far as that fuchsia bush. Come along. The fuchsia bush was tall. It fell over the fence in a shower. There was a little pit of darkness beneath. No, really, I don't want to, said Beryl. For a moment, Harry Kember didn't answer. Then he came close to her, turned to her, smiled, and said quickly, Don't be silly. Don't be silly. His smile was something she had never seen before. Was he drunk? That bright, blind, terrifying smile froze her with horror. What was she doing? How had she got there? The stern guardian asked her as the gate pushed open and quick as a cat, Harry Kember came through and snatched her to him. "Cold little devil, cold little devil," said the hateful voice. But Beryl was strong. She slipped, ducked, wrenched free. "You are vile, vile," said she. "Then why in God's name did you come?" stammered Harry Kember. Nobody answered him. A cloud, small, serene, floated across the moon. In that moment of darkness, the sea sounded deep, troubled. Then the clouds sailed away, and the sound of the sea was a vague murmur, as though it waked out of a dark dream. All was still.